You probably assume that if you strip away all the messy, unpredictable layers of the universe, like the biology, the chemistry, the chaotic swirls of astrophysics,
Yeah.
you eventually hit the bedrock.
Right, the foundation.
Exactly. And that bedrock, we're taught, is mathematics. It's the clean, comforting geometry of reality.
2 plus 2 is 4.
Right. You have an object, you count it, that's 1. You have a second object, you count it, that's 2. We assume that numbers, sets, and the fundamental laws of physics are just the raw materials of existence. They just sort of are.
They're a given.
Yeah. But what if they aren't the beginning? What if mathematics itself isn't a pre-existing eternal truth, but something that had to be manufactured from something even deeper?
Which is a wildly uncomfortable thought for most physicists.
It really is. What if, when you dig beneath the basement of reality, the foundation isn't a grid of numbers, but something entirely preformal and completely unmapped?
It is the absolute definition of theoretical muddy waters. I mean, we take for granted that a number is the start of the conversation. But we rarely ask what structural conditions actually have to be met before a universe can even count to 1.
Which is wild to think about.
Yeah, because in standard foundational mathematics, whether you're looking at, say, Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory or the Peano axioms, you always start with an assumption. You assume an empty set exists, or, you assume an initial object exists.
You're starting on step 1 instead of step 0.
Exactly. You're already starting after the curtain has gone up.
Okay, let's unpack this, because that exact tension is what brings us to today's source material. And I have to warn you, if you're listening, it is a truly paradigm-shifting text.
It's massive.
It is a massive, incredibly dense 2026 paper by Philip Lilien out of the UCTE Foundation. It's titled The Closure Origin of Mathematics and Physical Manifestation. And the subtitle is From Omnilectic Invariance to the Seed Tetrad.
Rolls right off the tongue.
Yeah, it really doesn't. But we have the primary paper here, plus this just giant stack of supplementary blueprints, diagrams, and diagnostic tables. And Lillian's whole premise is that traditional math starts too late.
Right. He argues that the standard math we rely on begins after what he calls disclosure has already occurred.
Disclosure.
Yes. Like, set theory assumes you already have a conceptual boundary to place objects within. Category theory assumes you already have morphisms and objects to map. Lilien is presenting an alternative pre-foundation called the UCCF solution.
The Unified Coherence Closure Framework.
That's the one. He posits that concepts like identity, coherence, and boundaries, they have to be generated before a number can even be conceptualized. Like, before you can look at the coffee cup on your desk and say, that is 1 cup, the universe itself must possess a mechanism to hold the identity of that cup together in a coherent state.
So our mission for you today is to climb what Lilien refers to as the ladder of reality. We're going to trace a single, unbroken, generative sequence.
From the very bottom.
From the absolute pre-formal invariant origin, a state way before numbers, before geometry, before time. And we're going to climb all the way up through the generation of basic math, into the laws of thermodynamics and physics, and eventually right up to the biological cells that make up your body.
It's vital to clarify right at the start, though, this isn't an exercise in throwing away standard physics or calculus.
Right. Don't burn your textbooks just yet.
Exactly. Your predictive models still work. General relativity hasn't been repealed by this paper. What Lilien is attempting is to discover the generative machinery running beneath those models.
The gears under the floorboards.
Yes. He is asking what algorithmic or ontological processes make standard mathematics possible in the first place.
Which means we can't start with numbers. We have to start at the absolute bottom of this ladder, in a place before the universe bothered to differentiate itself into things.
The absolute 0 point.
Yeah, and the text designates this starting point as O infinity, or omnilectic invariance. The blueprints describe it as the invariant preformal source condition prior to number, relation, dimension, operation, and distinction.
Omnilectic invariance. And the crucial mind-bending thing to grasp here is that this is not a mathematical object.
Right, you can't just put it in a calculator.
No, you cannot plug O infinity into a tensor field or a differential equation. It is the raw condition from which the disclosure of any measurable thing becomes possible.
Okay, but how does that differ from just the vacuum of space?
Well, if we think about how we usually define nothingness in physics, like the quantum vacuum, We're still talking about a space that has fluctuating fields, energy potentials, and metric properties.
Oh, I see. It's still a thing.
Exactly. It's a stage waiting for actors. Omnilectic invariance is prior to the stage itself. You can't measure a distance because dimension hasn't been generated yet. You can't identify a fluctuation because identity hasn't been established.
It's reality before reality has drawn any borders at all. But I have to push back here immediately because this feels like a linguistic trap to me.
How so?
Well, if omnilectic invariance exists prior to any distinction, prior to any objects or operations, how can we even talk about it? The moment the paper slaps a Greek letter on it and calls it O infinity, or introduces its first conceptual iteration, which it calls zeta naught, aren't we instantly turning it into an object?
That is the big question, yeah.
Doesn't the sheer act of naming it contradict the premise that it's preformal?
What's fascinating here is how Lilien actually anticipates that exact philosophical trap. The framework addresses it by drawing a rigid, almost surgical line between the act of disclosure and the act of creation.
Disclosure versus creation, right?
By assigning the symbol zeta naught, which he calls the naught form of omnilectic invariance, we aren't creating a mathematical object that can be manipulated through arithmetic.
So what are we doing?
We are formally acknowledging a generative nullity.
Generative nullity. I mean, that sounds like an oxymoron.
It does, yeah, until you examine how we historically treat zero. In standard arithmetic, zero is just a flat absence. It is the cancellation of a value.
I have 0 apples.
Exactly. But in closure mathematics, zero is redefined as a veiled manifold.
A veiled manifold.
Yes. It is not an empty void. It is the invariant origin behind all differentiated zero functions.
Wait, there's more than one kind of zero?
Oh, absolutely. There is a difference between the empty zero of having no apples, the potential zero of a balanced equation like 5 minus 5 equals 0, and the operational zero of a null vector.
Okay, yeah, I see that.
Zeta naught is the root system beneath all those different types of absence. It is the condition from which structure will eventually emerge, hidden behind a veil of non-disclosure.
So if I'm tracking this, zeta naught isn't the empty box. It's the reason the concept of emptiness can even exist.
That's a great way to put it.
It is a source veiled as a nullity. But that immediately begs the question, if this origin isn't just an empty void, how does something actually emerge from it?
Yeah.
How do we get from a veiled preformal state to the math that governs the orbit of planets?
That transitions us from the preformal state to the actual mechanism of emergence.
Yep.
And the framework anchors this entirely on a concept called the orthogonal zero-veil axiom.
The orthogonal zero-veil axiom.
Yes. And it fundamentally redefines what we mean by orthogonality.
Right. Because when you and I hear orthogonal, we usually think of a geometry class. 2 lines intersecting at a 90-degree angle.
The x and y axis.
Yeah, exactly. The x-axis is orthogonal to the y-axis.
Yeah.
But Lilien is very explicit that in this pre-foundational space, orthogonality is not just spatial perpendicularity.
No, not at all.
He defines it as a mode of hidden non-interference, independent generation, and unreducing distinction.
To understand this, let's look at the notation he uses for the orthogonal zero-veil axiom. It's a 0 with a perpendicular symbol as a subscript, 0 perp. The axiom states that every orthogonal generative direction appears as 0 relative to a closure frame that cannot yet perceive or disclose it.
Okay, let me try an analogy to ground this for you, the listener, because it's a super heavy concept. We can't use basic spatial analogies, but think about an advanced topological concept, like moving from a 2-dimensional flatland into a 3-dimensional space.
Or even complex numbers.
Oh, perfect, yeah. Think about complex numbers.
Yeah.
If you have a purely real number line, just the x-axis of real numbers, and you have a mathematical operation that requires an imaginary number, the imaginary axis is completely invisible to the real number line.
Right, it doesn't cross over.
Exactly. It is perfectly orthogonal.
Yeah.
If you were a mathematician restricted only to the real number line, the imaginary axis has 0 projection into your world. It registers as a total nullity.
That is an excellent way to visualize it. The imaginary axis acts as a veil. It isn't that the complex space doesn't exist. It's that the restricted frame of the real number line simply cannot disclose it.
Exactly. So to the real number line, the orthogonal direction is veiled. It acts as both a veil hiding the new dimension and a root pointing back to the origin, to zeta naught. And this brings us to the actual equation for emergence in the text, which is GC of 0 perp equals D perp.
Let's break down the mechanics of that equation.
Let's do it.
So GC represents the closure generation operator. This is the operative function that acts upon the veiled orthogonal, the zero perp.
Okay.
When it does so, it forces that hidden direction to drop its veil, producing d perp, which is a disclosed structure.
So emergence isn't a magic trick. It's not creating reality ex nihilo out of an absolute empty nothingness. It is the act of forcing an orthogonal non-disclosure to become a structure.
Right.
It's forcing that imaginary axis to suddenly map itself onto reality so we can interact with it.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the philosophical implications here are just staggering.
They really are.
I mean, for millennia, physics and metaphysics have been completely paralyzed by the problem of how you get something from nothing. The UCCF framework bypasses the paradox entirely.
Because you never had nothing.
Exactly. You never had nothing. You had a veiled manifold. Emergence is simply the structured, sequential unveiling of hidden directions.
The structured unveiling of hidden directions. I love that phrasing so much. But what exactly gets unveiled first? Because the text is super clear that the universe doesn't just suddenly spit out the number one or a perfect geometric sphere.
No. The very first things to emerge from the zero veil are the functional rules of unity. The framework calls this the seed tetrad, or the generative alphabet.
The seed tetrad. So this is denoted as naught.
Yes, S naught. This is the moment the preformal origin actually becomes operative. The blueprints isolate 4 specific foundational equations that emerge when the zero veil is operated on.
And what's brilliant is how Lilien maps these to standard arithmetic conventions, but completely reinterprets their ontological meaning.
Yes. Looking at the diagnostic tables, these 4 equations all share a numerical identity in standard math. They all equal 1.
Right. But Lilien argues they mean entirely different things about how reality constructs a unified system. Let's really dig into these, because they form the scaffolding for the rest of the deep dive.
We have to.
So the first seed equation is 0 to the power of 0 equals 1.
In the UCCF framework, this equation represents unity from null potential, and its disclosure generates the coherence operator, labeled with a capital C.
Coherence.
Mechanically, coherence is the prerequisite for anything to exist as a unified state before any actual mathematical operation has occurred. It is the structural integrity of a concept.
Like the glue.
Think of it exactly as the gravitational glue of logic. Before you can even define the boundaries of an object, you must have the coherent potential for an object to hold together rather than remaining infinitely dispersed.
Okay, so unity from null potential gives us coherence. The second equation is 0 factorial equals 1. The text maps this to unity from empty operation, and it discloses the identity operator, I.
Consider what a factorial is.
It's an operation.
It's a sequential operation, yeah. You take a number and multiply it by all the integers below it. So 0 factorial equals 1 is profoundly strange in standard math. How does an operation that starts with 0 yield 1?
That's a great question.
In closure mathematics, this signifies that even when an operation acts upon emptiness, the mere structural act of the operation establishes a bounded identity.
So the act of operating creates the boundary.
Yes. Identity, or I, is what allows a mathematical frame to say this is distinct from the background, coherence is the glue, identity is the boundary line.
Which brings us to the third equation, and this one relies on Euler's identity. It's negative e to the power of I pi equals 1. The blueprint defines this as unity through phase completion, disclosing the rotation or phase operator R.
Euler's identity is already considered one of the most beautiful equations in standard math because it unifies fundamental constants. But Lilien looks at the mechanics of it.
What does he see?
The exponent involves pi and the imaginary unit I, which mathematically represents a half rotation in the complex plane.
Okay.
The negative sign completes the full rotation, returning the value to 1. This operator, R, is the foundational mandate for transformation.
So it's about change.
Exactly. Without it, a system could never oscillate, invert, or undergo change while remaining a single, unified entity. It establishes that a closed system can experience internal phase shifts and still retain its unity.
Wow. And the final gear in this tetrad is infinity to the power of 0 equals 1. The text calls this unity across infinite scale neutralization, and it discloses the scale operator, S.
The scale operator ensures that unity is preserved regardless of magnitude. It dictates that the logical coherence and identity of a mathematical structure do not collapse simply because the structure is extended to microscopic or cosmic extremes.
It neutralizes the destructive potential of infinite recursion. So we have these 4 primitive gears: coherence C, identity I, rotation R, and scale S. They form the primitive closure operator set, And the paper asserts that this tetrad is provisionally minimal.
Meaning the UCTE Foundation hasn't found a fifth irreducible unity function that cannot be derived from combinations of these four.
That's a bold claim. These four operators form the absolute minimum alphabet required to write the language of mathematics.
That's the argument.
Okay, I have to step in with some heavy skepticism here. Because if you're a mathematician listening to this, you might literally be tearing your hair out.
I can imagine.
In standard calculus, 0 to the power of 0 and infinity to the power of 0 are often treated as indeterminate forms.
Right, you can't just solve them outright.
Exactly. You have to use L'Hopital's rule to evaluate limits taking those forms. And depending on the function, they don't always equal 1. Sometimes they equal e or 0 or infinity. Is Lilien just ignoring the last 3 centuries of calculus? Is he saying limits are broken?
This raises a really important question, and it's a critique Lilien addresses directly in the supplementary notes. He is absolutely not claiming that 0 to the power of 0 equals 1 is an unrestricted analytic equality that you can just haphazardly plug into a complex limit problem in calculus.
Okay, good.
He isn't trying to break L'Hopital's rule.
Then how does he justify using indeterminate forms as his bedrock?
By treating them as generative unity conventions. Remember, we are operating pre-foundationally here. We are beneath the level where functions and limits have even been constructed.
Right.
These equations are not meant to be arithmetic operations. They are symbolic disclosures. They are the linguistic way that closure mathematics expresses the initial emergence of coherence, identity, rotation, and scale from the zero veil.
Oh, I see.
Think of them as the mathematical shadows cast onto our reality by the primitive operators waking up.
Ah. So when he writes 0 to the power of 0 equals 1, he isn't saying 0 multiplied by itself 0 times. He is using the symbols to express that pure null potential inevitably yields a singular coherent unity.
It's ontological, not purely arithmetic.
Exactly. And once you have these 4 primitive operators, this generative alphabet, you can start combining them to build the math that we do use every day.
Yes.
This is what the framework categorizes as first-order closures, or T1. Let's build some math then.
Let's do it.
How do we get something as simple as a mathematical relation? In standard math, a relation is just a property that holds between 2 or more objects. You draw a line between point A and point B and you have a relation.
Simple enough.
But the UCCF formula for relation is vastly more demanding. The equation is rel A, B equals C of A and B, AND I of A, AND I of B, AND D of A and B.
It looks totally daunting, but logically it's airtight. Standard math assumes that point A and point B just exist, waiting to be related. Lilien says no.
They have to be built.
Yes. To forge a relation, you must first deploy the identity operator to establish A as a distinct bounded unit, that is I of A.
Right.
You must do the exact same for B, establishing I of B. Then there must be a measurable difference between them, represented by D of A and B. If there is no difference, they are the same identity, and relation collapses right back into singularity.
And finally, the coherence operator.
Yes, C of A and B. You must have a coherent conceptual space holding A and B together. If they exist in entirely different, non-intersecting topological spaces with no coherence linking them, they cannot relate.
They can't see each other.
Exactly. Therefore, the definition of relation becomes identity held in coherent difference.
Identity held in coherent difference. That immediately makes standard set theory look almost lazy by comparison.
It really does.
And it gets even more rigorous when we define number. Standard set theory, like von Neumann ordinals, defines numbers using empty sets. The number 0 is the empty set. The number 1 is the set containing the empty set. It sets all the way down.
Right.
But Lilien defines number as iterated identity under coherent scale. And his formula is num equals C composed with S composed with I. Number equals coherence composed with scale composed with identity.
Think about the actual mechanics of counting. It is not a passive observation. It is a highly active process. To count 3 separate items, you must first utilize the identity operator I to recognize the discrete nature of a single unit.
You have to know what one is.
Exactly. But to increment that count, to move from 1 to 2 to 3, you must apply the scale operator S. You have to repeat the identity across an extended metric without losing the definition of the original unit.
You can't start counting apples and end up counting oranges.
Precisely. And finally, the coherence operator, C, binds those distinct scaled instances into a single totalized concept, a sum. Counting requires the sameness of the unit and the difference of the instance simultaneously.
So a number isn't a pre-existing Platonic form floating out in the ether somewhere. A number is an active, ongoing sequence of operations.
It is a complex recipe holding itself together.
And here's where it gets really interesting to mention. Standard physics treats spatial dimensions like an empty Tupperware container. The universe has 3 spatial dimensions, and they just sit there, passively waiting to be filled with stars and planets.
Like an empty room.
Yeah. But the framework defines dimension with the formula dim equals GC of 0 perp.
The closure generation operator acting on the veiled orthogonal.
Right. Which means a dimension isn't an empty box. It is an active, disclosed direction of closure. The paper calls it stable orthogonal extension.
Yes.
It is the ongoing result of a 0 veil being forced open and held open by the primitive operators.
The paradigm shift here for the listener is profound. I mean, we intuitively believe that the dimensional grid of the universe is just a passive backdrop.
It's just the paper we draw on.
Right. But Lilien argues that the grid itself is a dynamic, continuous achievement. A spatial dimension only exists because a veiled generative direction achieved enough mathematical stability to present itself as an axis.
It takes work to exist.
Constant work. If the operator stopped maintaining it, the dimension wouldn't just empty out, it would cease to be disclosed entirely. It would fold back into the 0 veil.
It's like realizing the screen of your television isn't a solid piece of glass, but millions of pixels constantly firing to maintain the illusion of a screen.
That's a perfect analogy.
And once these first-order closures are up and running, once you have relations, numbers, and dimensions actively generating, they start interacting with each other. This pushes us up the ladder to the second-order closures, or T2, and leads us to the origin of conservation laws.
As the first-order primitives interact, they generate highly complex secondary behaviors. The paper provides a synthesis map outlining 3 major ones: measure, symmetry, and transformation.
Let's detail how those are built. Measure is defined as number applied to relation across dimension.
Okay.
The formula is measure equals num, composed with rel, composed with dim. So measurement isn't fundamental at all. It requires a massive amount of pre-existing scaffolding.
Exactly. You cannot have a physical measurement until you have an actively generated dimension, a coherent relation within that dimension, and a scaled numbering system to quantify it.
Next is symmetry. Usually symmetry just means a shape looks the same if you flip it in a mirror. But closure math defines symmetry as identity preserved through transformation.
It is sameness persisting through difference.
Which brings us to the linchpin of T2 transformation. Lilien defines transformation strictly as coherent identity through change. And he establishes a really severe logical boundary here.
He does.
If a mathematical structure undergoes a process, but no part of its original identity is preserved, that is not a transformation. That is dissolution.
The original structure died and a new one replaced it.
Exactly. Conversely, if no change occurs to the state of the structure, it's just static persistence. True transformation demands that a core identity survives while its state changes.
And this strict definition of transformation is what births one of the most critical bridges in theoretical physics conservation.
Let's look at the equation in the blueprint. It's IC of t of x equals IC of x, which implies QC equals a constant.
Let me unpack the notation for the listener.
Please do.
Suppose we have a mathematical system or structure, which we'll denote as X. Every structure in the UCCF framework possesses a closure identity, an invariant foundational core that makes it what it is. We label this IC.
Okay.
Now, we apply a transformation, T, to this system. We rotate it, we stretch it, we shift its phase. We now have the transformed state, T of X.
So we are comparing the core identity of the original structure to the core identity of the transformed structure.
Precisely. The equation dictates that if the closure identity of the transformed system IC of T of X is perfectly identical to the closure identity of the original system IC of X, then a conservation relation is automatically generated. The parameter QC remains constant.
Okay, I want to pause and make sure I fully grasp the magnitude of this.
Go ahead.
The laws of conservation in physics, like the conservation of energy, the conservation of angular momentum, the rules that govern everything from thermodynamics to quantum fields, these aren't just arbitrary laws that the universe randomly decided to enforce.
Well, according to this, no.
They are the unavoidable mathematical byproducts of a core identity, stubbornly refusing to break apart during a transformation.
That is exactly what he is arguing. What's fascinating here is how this recontextualizes Noether's theorem.
Oh, Noether.
Yes. For those who might need a refresher, Noether proved mathematically that every continuous symmetry in the physical universe corresponds directly to a conservation law.
Right.
Spatial translation symmetry gives you the conservation of momentum. Time translation symmetry gives you the conservation of energy. It is considered one of the most beautiful and fundamental theorems in all of physics.
It connects the shape of the universe to the laws of the universe. But Lilien is placing Noether's theorem inside an even deeper generative sequence.
He is. Noether's linked symmetry directly to conservation. Lilien asks, where does the symmetry come from?
Wow. In his framework, the chain of causality is much longer. It starts with the primitive operators achieving closure. Closure generates an invariant identity, IC. When that invariant identity survives a transformation, it produces symmetry, and that symmetry manifests as conservation.
So Noether's theorem isn't the bottom floor.
No, it is the physical expression of an underlying closure invariance. Physical laws are inherited directly from pre-foundational mathematical stubbornness.
That is a massive aha moment. We've built the math, we've built dimensions, we've built the rules of change, we've built the laws of conservation.
We're climbing the ladder.
We are, but math is wild. Math allows for infinite, impossible structures. You can easily write an equation for a 17-dimensional hypersphere with negative mass.
Sure.
But I don't see any of those sitting in my living room. How do we filter out the infinite mathematical possibilities to get the actual physical reality that we experience? How do we cross the bridge from pure math to actual physics? This is where we encounter the concept that Lilien calls the manifestation constraint, denoted as K sub m. This is the absolute boundary condition of physical reality.
The paper explicitly redefines what physics actually is. The formula is physics equals C plus conservation plus constraint plus manifestation.
It argues that physics is not a separate discipline from mathematics. It is simply the subset of closure mathematics that is capable of stabilizing under the manifestation constraint.
Think about the sheer volume of mathematical structures generated by the closure operators. It's a landscape of infinite topological shapes and dimensional arrays.
Boundless.
But our physical universe has limited bandwidth. Information theory and thermodynamics place strict limits on what can actually persist. The manifestation constraint is the universal filter.
A mathematical structure can only transition into a physical reality if it can maintain its closure identity when squeezed through the limits of manifestation.
Okay, let me offer an analogy here. If you're listening to this and wondering how pure math becomes a coffee cup, think about a high-end video game rendering engine like Unreal Engine. Okay, the purely mathematical code of the engine is capable of calculating an infinite number of polygons, infinite light ray bounces, and impossible gravity-defying physics. The math has no inherent limits.
Right.
But the physical gaming console sitting under your TV has a hard memory limit. It has a GPU bottleneck. That hardware limit is the manifestation constraint, K sub m.
That's a great comparison.
The engine can dream up infinite structures, but only the objects that survive the constraint of the console's processing power actually render on your screen as the physics of the game. Physics is just constrained mathematics.
That analogy holds up perfectly under Lilien's framework. And because physics is merely a constrained subset of math, Lilien goes on to radically redefine the fundamental vocabulary we use to describe the physical world. Let's look at how he defines an entity.
In standard physics, we think of an entity as a thing, a lump of matter occupying space, a proton, a rock, a planet. But the UCCF defines an entity purely through algebraic topology. An entity is defined as IC, partial C, K sub m.
Let's translate that.
Yes, please.
An entity is a conserved closure identity, IC, equipped with a mathematical boundary, partial C, that successfully survives the manifestation constraint, K sub m.
So it's not a thing.
It is not a solid lump of stuff. It is a structural persistence. It is a mathematical system that has figured out how to draw a boundary around itself and survive the filter.
And this framework completely dissolves the wave-particle duality paradox that has been a giant headache in quantum mechanics for a century, because it defines a field as a distributed closure identity across a domain and a particle as a localized closure identity under boundary constraint.
Exactly. A field and a particle are not two contradictory types of physical matter. They're simply two different topological strategies that a closure identity uses to manage its boundary constraints.
So it's the same thing acting differently.
Yes. The identity can distribute its persistence smoothly across a domain, acting as a field, or it can tightly localize its boundary, acting as a particle.
And what about mass? This is the one that really threw me. The text defines mass as localized closure persistence under transformation.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, This forces a complete rewiring of how we perceive reality. Traditionally, we think of mass as an intrinsic property of matter. It's the amount of stuff packed into a particle. Or arguing that mass is not a property of stuff. Mass is a measure of stubbornness. It is a mathematical metric of how fiercely a localized closure identity resists dissolution when the universe attempts to transform it. Inertia is literally a mathematical resistance to losing identity.
Mass is structural stubbornness. I mean, that is just beautiful.
And
force. The equation given is negative del V sub c. Force is defined as the measurable appearance of a closure system responding to a gradient.
when a closure system exists in an environment with a potential gradient, say a difference in energy or spatial curvature, it has to dynamically adjust its internal parameters to maintain its identity.
To stay alive, essentially.
Exactly. That necessary mathematical adjustment, that desperate balancing act to avoid dissolution, is what we physically measure as a force.
Okay, this is theoretically breathtaking. It's elegant. But as you constantly remind me, elegance isn't science.
It has to be tested.
To prove this isn't just high-level armchair philosophy, Lilien has to prove it max to the real world. He has to take this pre-foundational math and apply it to the most rigorous, battle-tested, decimal-perfect model in human history, the standard model of particle physics.
And this plunges us into the most mathematically dense part of the paper, the infrater gauge bridge.
The infrater gauge bridge, okay.
Oh, this is undoubtedly where the framework makes its boldest and most verifiable claims. The standard model of particle physics is built entirely on gauge theory.
Right.
Specifically, it relies on three internal symmetry groups that govern the fundamental forces, denoted mathematically as U1 cross SU2 cross SU3.
Just to ground this for the listener, these symmetry groups correspond to the fundamental forces. U1 maps to electromagnetism, SU2 maps to the weak nuclear force, which governs radioactive decay, and SU3 maps to the strong nuclear force, which holds quarks together inside protons. Perfectly summarized. Now, in standard physics, these gauge groups work flawlessly. The math is immaculate. But physicists will openly admit they don't really know why the universe chose these specific symmetries. They just sort of...
They just exist.
Yeah, they just are. But Lilien argues they are not arbitrary at all.
He claims they are inevitable. He defines these gauge groups as the manifest algebraic shadow of differentiated closure depths. He refers to these depths as infrater levels.
The manifest algebraic shadow. So going back to our earlier analogy, the forces we experience are just the 2D shadows cast by a 3D mathematical structure.
Yes.
And the blueprint specifically highlights the generator pattern of the standard model. The pattern is 138.
Let's look at that.
Group U1 has 1 generator. SU2 has 3 generators. SU3 has 8 generators. Lilien argues this 138 progression is not an accident. It represents increasing internal closure richness. Phase, then torsion, then confinement.
Let's walk down the closure ladder depths to examine how he specifically maps this progression. To represent these depths, the framework assigns fractional dimensional values to each regime of stabilization.
Let me list these fractional dimensions from the table, and I'm going to need you to unpack them deeply because dropping fractional dimensions sounds a lot like science fiction.
It does, but bear with me.
Okay, level 1 is 3.14D, labeled the source band. Coherence curvature, partial closure.
Okay.
Level 2 is 3.0D. This maps directly to U1. Phase closure, the interface of electromagnetism.
Right.
Level 3 is 2.85D. This maps to SU2. Torsional transaction closure, weak sector torsion.
Yes.
And level 4 is 2.70D. This maps to SU3, confinement closure, strong sector color. Okay, I have to stop and push back hard.
Go for it.
3.14D, 2.85D. Is Lilien trying to say that there are invisible fractional dimensions hovering just out of sight?
No.
Is this like string theory, where we have 11 spatial dimensions curled up in a Calabi-Yau manifold hiding inside every point in space? Because we've spent decades looking for those extra dimensions and haven't found a shred of empirical evidence.
This raises an incredibly important distinction, and if you misinterpret this, the entire framework collapses. Lilien is not advocating for extra spatial dimensions in the string theory sense.
Okay, so what are they?
You cannot physically travel into a 2.85-dimensional space. They are not curled-up geometries.
So what do these numbers actually mean? Why 3.14? Why 2.85?
They are closure depths. They represent the mathematical degrees of freedom required to sustain a specific type of operative interaction. Let's look at 3.14D, the source band. Notice how close that number is to pi.
3.14, yeah.
In geometry, pi is a ratio required to perfectly close a circle or a sphere. The 3.14D depth represents the absolute maximum limit of spatial curvature before a structure loses its ability to maintain coherence. It is the boundary layer of spatial manifestation.
Ah, so it's a structural limit, not a physical place.
Exactly. Now let's dive deeper. As mathematical constraints tighten, the available degrees of freedom drop. At exactly 3.0D, phase closure stabilizes. This stabilization casts an algebraic shadow that we identify as the U1 symmetry group, giving us electromagnetism.
Wow, okay.
If you restrict the mathematical degrees of freedom even further, diving down to the 2.85D depth, torsional transactions mathematically stabilize. This constraint requires 3 generators to maintain its identity, casting the shadow of the SU2 symmetry group, giving us the weak force.
And if you constrain it even further, down to 2.70D, you hit confinement closure. The structure is so tightly bound it requires 8 generators to prevent dissolution.
Exactly.
This casts the shadow of SU3, the strong force, which perfectly explains why quarks are permanently confined and cannot be isolated.
It is a stunningly cohesive model. The forces of nature aren't independent actors. They are just what physics looks like at different depths of mathematical constraint.
And this radically reinterprets major pillars of contemporary physics, such as the Higgs mechanism.
Oh, absolutely.
Yes, let's talk about the Higgs. In the standard model, the Higgs field is an energy field that permeates the universe, and particles acquire mass by dragging through it. It's often compared to moving through molasses. Does the UCCF framework throw the Higgs field out?
No, it reinterprets it entirely. In Lilien's model, the Higgs mechanism is the standard model's expression of this deeper closure stabilization process.
So it's not molasses.
No, the Higgs field isn't a vat of molasses. It is the active mechanism that translates these infra-tier gauge constraints into the localized structural stubbornness we call mass. It is the mathematical tether anchoring these fractional depths to our 3D reality.
Okay, this is a beautiful piece of theoretical architecture. But a beautiful theory that can't be tested is just poetry.
Right.
How does the UCCF framework translate into empirical science? Can we actually run an experiment to prove this? That brings us to the final portion of the paper empirical signatures and target domains.
Lilien is highly disciplined about the requirement for empirical falsifiability. He doesn't just present the math. He outlines a rigorous multi-decade research program.
A pipeline.
A clear pipeline. Closure ontology must lead to a computable closure parameter, which must yield a specific closure signature, which can then be empirically compared against actual particle collider data or cosmological observations.
Let's dig into the actual mechanics of these closure parameters, because this is where the theoretical rubber meets the road. The paper lists a series of parameters that need to be mathematically computed from the framework.
Let's hear them.
First is lambda sub c, the closure eigenvalue. The paper defines this as the stable mode value of a specific operator. Next is kappa sub c, which it calls closure coercivity.
Coercivity is a brilliant term here.
How so?
In materials science, coercivity is the measure of a magnet's resistance to becoming demagnetized. In closure math, kappa sub c is the precise measurement of a mathematical structure's resistance to dissolution when subjected to a transforming gradient.
So it calculates exactly how much energy is required to break an identity.
Precisely.
Then we have rho sub c, closure density, which represents the concentration of closure operations within a specific regime. There is chi sub c for chirality or torsion, which maps to the left-handedness of the weak force. There is gamma sub c for the confinement index, mapping to the strong force, and finally eta sub m, the manifestation compatibility.
The manifestation compatibility, eta sub m, calculates the probability that a generated mathematical structure can actually survive the manifestation constraint and appear in physical reality.
So the goal of this entire research program is to sit down, compute these exact Greek letters mathematically using pure closure logic, and then check if those calculated numbers precisely match the physical constants we measure in the real universe.
Like the mass of an electron or the fine structure constant, yes.
And where exactly does Lilien think these parameters will apply? The paper outlines several target domains spanning from the subatomic to the cosmic. Let's start with particle physics. Standard physics currently recognizes 3 generations of fermions. You have the electron, the muon, and the tau particle, each heavier than the last. But standard physics doesn't possess a fundamental reason why there are exactly 3 generations. It's just what we observe.
The UCCF framework interprets these 3 generations as 3 recurrence tiers of localized closure. The mathematics of the closure depths organically stack in a way that creates 3 stable configurations.
Just 3.
Just 3. And crucially, this yields a hard, falsifiable prediction. The framework predicts that there is no fourth ordinary stable generation of fermions. The mathematics of the manifestation constraint simply will not support the structural integrity of a fourth tier.
That is exactly the kind of testable prediction the theory needs. If we build a massive next-generation supercollider and discover a stable fourth generation of fermions, Lilien's framework is empirically dead.
It's completely dead.
But if we continue to search for decades and never find one, it strongly bolsters the recurrence tier model. What about neutrinos? They are notorious for breaking rules.
Neutrinos have mass, but it is incredibly tiny. And they oscillate. They change their flavor from electron to muon to tau neutrinos as they travel through space.
Standard physics models this mechanically.
Right. But the UCCF framework views neutrino oscillation as closure basis rotation. Because they exist at the absolute threshold of the manifestation constraint, they are constantly rotating their internal closure identities to maintain coherence.
So they're just spinning to stay alive.
If physicists can calculate the exact phase rotation using closure math, it could predict the precise parameters of neutrino mass splittings, which is something the standard model currently really struggles with.
But the framework doesn't stop at the quantum level. It scales all the way up to cosmology. The paper suggests that cosmic voids and galactic filaments, the massive web-like macro structures of the universe, are the macro result of coherence gradient structure selections.
Imagine the early universe as a chaotic spread of potential. As the universe expands, it creates gradients. The framework suggests that matter doesn't just randomly clump together due to gravity.
It sorts itself.
It sorts itself out based on these exact closure principles. The galactic filaments are regions where closure coherence is maximized, and the cosmic voids are the regions where the structural identity failed to stabilize.
It's the exact same mathematics governing a quark, scaled up to 1 billion light years.
It's beautiful.
The application sweeps through other disciplines, too. It applies to fluid dynamics, treating the chaotic transition of a fluid into turbulence as staged partial closure transitions, searching for stability in closure minima. It extends into chemistry, attempting to mathematically prove that atomic bond energies and activation barriers are just expressions of closure minima.
And then it reaches the ultimate target domain.
Biology. The framework defines biological life as the ultimate macroscopic expression of this pre-foundational math. It defines a living cell as a boundary-maintained closure.
It is a stunning synthesis. I mean, in this view, a biological cell isn't just a sack of chemicals. It is a localized closure identity that has weaponized metabolism.
Weaponized metabolism.
Yes. It utilizes metabolic processes to actively maintain its boundary constraint, partial C, against the constant threat of dissolution and entropy. Life is simply the highest, most complex iteration of the exact same mathematical stubbornness that gives an electron its mass.
But I appreciate how careful Lilien is in framing this. The paper doesn't suffer from hubris. He doesn't claim to have already calculated the mass of every particle or solved the theory of everything in a weekend.
No, not at all.
He is presenting a pre-foundational architecture. This is a map for a research program that will likely take generations of physicists and mathematicians to fully compute.
Precisely. It is an invitation to rewire how we approach theoretical physics for the next 100 years.
Okay, we have covered an immense amount of ground. So what does this all mean? Let's take a breath and summarize this latter for you, the listener, because the sheer scale of this unbroken sequence is awe-inspiring.
It really is.
We started in a conceptual void omnilectic invariance. From that preformal state, we identified a generative nullity, zeta naught. That nullity veiled hidden orthogonal directions. When that zero veil was mathematically forced to disclose itself, it birthed the generative alphabet, the seed tetrad.
The 4 operative rules.
Yes. Coherence, identity, rotation, and scale. Those 4 rules combine to build mathematical relations, numbers, and the very dimensions of space. Those structures interacted to create transformations, and the stubborn identities that survived those transformations birthed the laws of conservation.
Which gave us physics.
Exactly. Those laws were then squeezed through the hard limits of the manifestation constraint, casting mathematical shadows that we observe as the gauge symmetries of the standard model, which built the quarks, which built the atoms, which built the molecules, which built the boundary-maintained closure of the biological cell.
It is a singular, unbroken continuum, from a preformal knot form to a living, breathing human being, all connected by the persistent, algorithmic drive of identity to maintain its structural closure against the void.
It fundamentally alters how you look at reality. If you look at the coffee cup on your desk right now, it isn't just a collection of atoms sitting in an empty space. It is a highly stabilized mathematical achievement, actively generating its own structural identity in real time.
It's a miracle it exists at all.
Truly. But I want to leave you with one final, deeply provocative thought. Something for you to mull over that builds directly on what we've discussed today.
Okay.
Notice that in Lilien's list of target domains, he stops at biology. He defines life as a boundary-maintained closure. But if you dig into the bibliography at the very end of this massive document, it lists Philip Lilien's other related upcoming works.
Yeah.
And there's one title buried at the very bottom, Qualionomics/Mathematical Ontology of Experience.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So think about this. If a biological cell is just a highly complex tier of closure mathematics stabilizing under physical constraints, what is human consciousness? What is the subjective feeling of reading a book or feeling joy or having the exact aha moment you might be having right now? Are your subjective thoughts, your qualia, simply the next tier of orthogonal disclosure?
That is heavy.
Is your mind, your awareness, just the universe attempting to finally unveil its own omnilectic origin back to itself?
That is the ultimate frontier, when the mathematics of closure finally turn the lens inward on the observer.
We began today talking about how we expect reality to be clean, binary, and comforting. We assumed that the math and physics were the solid bedrock of existence. But it turns out, beneath the calculus, beneath the quantum fields, there is no solid bedrock. There's only the continuous, breathtaking act of generative disclosure.
Reality isn't made of static things.
No, it's made of veils dropping. Thanks for climbing the ladder with us. We'll see you in the next deep dive.